buildings that we currently have in the world sort of contribute between 30 and 40% of carbon to the atmosphere. And then in New Zealand, our building industry sort of contributes nearly 50% to landfill waste. So we can't keep doing things the way we always have. The planet just can't sustain that. And current predictions have the global population increasing by 80 million people per annum. That equates to a lot of building needed to house those people. So in a way to make that sort of relevant to New Zealand, that equates to building a city the size of Auckland every week. So we can't keep using concrete, using steel the way we always have, that we need to do things differently. And that's what I'm most passionate about, is how do we do things differently? How do we think differently about how we live, the way we live, the way we build? What does that mean? How do we use the buildings that we have? And also, for me, how do we then use design and design thinking to come up with different solutions? And we have students doing things that I could only dream of when I was an architecture student, and starting to lead the way. That students are coming up with circular economy systems that just didn't even exist. So designing a whole building system that can respond to the waste that we produce, or using AR and robots to create different ways of constructing materials. So we have a massive robot arm that can print concrete. So I've currently got a PhD student who's printing concrete with that, and another student who previously looked at using it to build buildings, so getting the robot to prefabricate buildings. So there's lots and lots of opportunities that, like I said, I could only dream of when I was a student, and the students are doing it and doing it amazingly well.
My final year project was a building in sort of rural Queenstown, or like the central Otago area, that looked at how to put a house in such an extreme climate that we currently don't regulate for as heavily as they do for similar climates overseas. And it took a scientific and poetic approach to design a relatively small house that had a really high performance envelope that also engaged with its landscape. The scientific approach measured the building's energy performance over an annual period, so looking at how much it might cost to heat or cool the building as the climate gets colder during the winter and hotter during the summer. And the poetic approach looked at how the building sits within its landscape, how it's used, how you move through it, what views you might see, how the space will feel in terms of how the light comes through the windows. So my project, I worked in many different mediums. So through building simulation and looking at sort of numbers, all the way through to digital modelling and physical modelling. My final year project made a sort of almost like an exhibition space where I got to sort of stack a whole lot of timber together and put it through a CNC machine and actually make the landscape and put the house on it. I did a lot of laser cutting. Laser cutting physical models helped communicate to people who were really visually orientated what the impact or how geometric thermal bridging can influence the performance of the building and how that relates back to the shape of the building. Physically being able to hand it to someone is a lot easier than showing them a bar graph. Having the access to those facilities inside the campus and being able to continuously test and prototype different objects was really useful. The sort of result from my master's project really sort of opened the door to do a PhD, continuing at the university, and that's now sort of branched into looking at commercial buildings and their carbon emissions, and looking at not just sort of operational impact, but also the impact of materials earlier in the life cycle that are locked in from design decisions made, like high amounts of structure or, again, envelope and geometry choice, down to sort of the carpet or sort of fit outs that they choose.
My name's Jed Finch. I'm a PhD candidate in architecture at the university, and I'm doing sustainable research. So I'm looking at the circular economy in the building industry and how that can sort of change the way we build buildings in this country. So the circular economy is sort of the next sustainable movement in buildings and in fact in all industries. So it's all about how do we reuse resources, how do we get the most life out of the resources that we deploy and use. It's a big challenge in the building industry because all our buildings are like, that's permanent, it should last forever, but the reality is that we're always changing things. So circular economy in the building industry is sort of one of the big challenges. Yeah. I started doing my master's thesis, so the 1-year thesis at the end of your architecture degree where you get to choose whatever you want to do. And I set out to look at the waste problem in buildings. I didn't know about the circular economy, I didn't know about any of these other ideas, and I quickly discovered that there was already a lot of research in this area, but there was also a big gap, and that was in how do you do it in New Zealand, but also how do you do it for an affordable price. So often lots of these proposed circular systems are very expensive and cost a lot of money, and so we thought, okay, what could we do in New Zealand that would be uniquely New Zealand and be able to address this problem? And so we just sort of designed a little research project around the circular economy and around timber, so around timber buildings and around construction. And so that was the master's. That was a year project, and it sort of just spiraled out of control from there in a good way, in a very good way. My research has been sort of outward focused in the sense that it's about engaging with the industry and seeing if we can do these things together. So it's all about actually building stuff and seeing if it works. And if it doesn't, then you go back and you iterate and you try it again. And so it's a really nice environment for failing. So you can do a lot of like testing and modeling and failing and breaking, and that's expected and it's part of the journey. So I've had a great time failing at things. So that's been sort of really, it's really challenging at the time because your work that you're doing is not working, it's not being successful, but then if you look back on it, you can see how far you've come through the testing. I think the things that really motivate me to do my research is about the issues that you see in the industry. So when you're at the architecture school, you do some sort of miniature like interviews and you get to know the practices out there, and you get to go to some building sites and you get to look at what the industry likes today or what it looks like today. And then you see how much it can be improved, and you see the potential for improvement, and then you get to sort of be inspired by that, and you know you're sort of uniquely positioned with all these tools and resources that the architecture school has, that you can do something that hasn't been done before, that hasn't been tried before. So it's very like motivating to introduce a new product or a new technology and get feedback on it. When there's so much like interest in buildings and construction, and it's such an important part of our lives, getting people excited about a different way to do it is really motivating, keeps you going. Yeah. The really exciting thing about architecture school is you can take what you're good at. So you might be a really good creative person with your hands, and then you can apply that to a whole lot of different skill areas. So for example, you might be part of a team on a project and you're designing a little village of houses or a subdivision, and you like making models, and so you'll be able to make the models, and you'll have team members that can do the digital models or do the simulations or do the technical drawings. And so it's really a great degree to do where you can feed together a whole lot of skills and have a lot of fun and produce some really cool work. Studying architecture is really great because you get so many career options when you're done studying. So for me, that was staying in the architecture school and becoming a research practitioner or an expert in research and new building technologies. But there's equal opportunities to go out and work for the government in terms of like building legislation, or you can work as an architectural practitioner, or you can work in the materials field. So there's heaps of options.